Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
If we as parents can make sure that the kids are spending time in books, in reading, with us and on their own, all of the evidence is definitely going to support a much healthier approach to reading and much better outcomes there.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
Hello, this is Dr. Justin Coulson. I'm here with Kylie, my wife, mum to our 6 daughters from grade 1 through to married and moved out of home. And today, the episode that I look forward to every month the most, the doctor's desk.
Well, I know I give you a hard time about this, but today's studies are actually quite intriguing. I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have here.
I've picked some crackers. One about smacking kids, one about screen usage and reading in little children, and another one for every parent comparing which country has the most burnt out parents. A 42 nation investigation of parental burnout. Where do you want to start, hun?
I think we do it in that order. Let's get punishment out of the road.
Right. You know what? I'd like to get that one gone as well, because as important as it is, it's also one of those topics that's like, oh gosh, it's heavy, but we need to talk about it again and again and again, because statistically we know that more than half of Australian parents have smacked their kids in the last week or so. Like it's a really common disciplinary practice still.
What new information came out of this study?
Not much that's new. In fact, everything that we've already known about spanking has just been emphasised again in this study, but there's a couple of important things about this one. So it was published in The Lancet. It's a very fancy medical journal, and it's called Physical Punishment and Child Outcomes, a narrative review of prospective studies. So this is the big thing with this, Kylie. So if I want to do a study, the gold standard is where I get a bunch of people and I randomly put them into groups. And the groups should be about even in terms of all the different characteristics of the people in those groups. And I get one group to do one thing and the other group doesn't do it. That's what we call a randomized controlled trial. The idea here would be that I get a bunch of parents to start smacking their kids and a bunch of people to not smack their kids, and we see what happens to the kids. But ethically, there's some issues with that. We're not supposed to tell people to smack their kids. That's not good. And so what we have to do instead is we have to do longitudinal studies, and we want to do them prospectively. In other words, we don't want to ask people to reflect back on what was happening. We want to study it as it happens over time and see what happens.
So how many families did they actually use for this particular study?
Yeah, this is a really big study. Instead of talking about the number of families overall, there were 69 studies incorporated into one. So this is what we call a meta-analysis, and it looks at a whole lot. It's a big review of 69 prospective longitudinal studies. It's about as close to gold standard as you can get, given that you can't ethically put people into groups and make them start hitting each other or not.
So what did they actually find? I mean, that's a big number.
Yeah.
There's a lot of studies going on here. So what did they actually find?
I'm actually surprised that there are still that many studies on spanking occurring, because we've got 50 years of evidence that supports what this particular piece of research highlighted.
But interestingly, with all of that research, we've still got so many parents who believe that this is the right thing to do.
Yeah. So let's be really clear. We don't want to make parents switch off the podcast and say, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to whack my kids if I want to." That's not our goal here. We don't want anyone to feel ashamed, but we do want you to feel a little bit of guilt, because guilt means that you're recognising that maybe there's something that you could do that's better. And that is critically important for what we try to do on the podcast and at happyfamilies.com.au. Here are there were 7 outcomes to discuss from this research. The first one, physical punishment consistently predicts increases in child behaviour problems over time.
That's interesting, because we all feel like if we give our kids a good smack, they'll stop doing the behaviour that we caught them doing, and they'll be less likely to do it in the future.
That's kind of the logic behind it, isn't it? Parents say, I'm doing it to teach my kids a lesson. I'm going to pull you up on one word. You said we all. I don't think that we all do. In fact, we mostly know now that it's not healthy. But what happens is, because we get instant compliance, a lot of parents think, well, I fixed the behaviour problem. The issue is you fix the problem right here, right now, but you don't solve anything over time. And that's what this data is really highlighting. Over time, child behaviour problems actually increase because we're using force to require a certain behaviour that is not intrinsic, and it's an unhealthy way to do it. Here's the second finding. Physical punishment is not associated with positive outcomes over time. And this has been found a number of times. Like so many studies now, no matter what variables we look at, kids don't improve when they get smacked. Third, physical punishment increases the risk of involvement with child protective services. It's probably worth pausing on that one for just a second, saying we're not saying, and this research isn't saying, that if you hit your kids, you're going to end up being picked up by child protection. What it's saying is that there is an association between smacking and being involved with these government organisations. And that's because the more you smack, the more likely it is that somebody's going to have to get involved at some point. A lot of parents will never get there, but there is that association that's been reported in the data.
My suggestion is that in many of those cases, smacking is the catalyst, but it's the rupture in the relationship that takes place that means others have to get involved.
Sure, but ultimately if people see parents hitting kids, they're going to put phone calls through. Things are going to be reported. Teachers are mandatory reporters. This stuff does get reported now. Here's the fourth one. The only evidence of children eliciting physical punishment is for externalising behaviour. In other words, the kids who act out are the ones that get hit. It's not the quiet kids. It's not the ones that have got depression and anxiety and that are hiding out in the room. It's what we call externalising, lashing out behaviour. That's what's most likely to elicit the spanking or the smacking. Fifth, physical punishment predicts worsening behaviour over time in what we call quasi-experimental studies. These are basically as close as you can get to doing an experiment without actually doing it. And there are two more outcomes. Associations between physical punishment and detrimental child outcomes are what the researchers call robust across child and parent characteristics. In other words, when you smack your kids, the more that happens, the more likely it is that they're going to exhibit detrimental outcomes rather than optimal outcomes. The study is going to be shared in our show notes. After the break, we're going to talk about these other two. Kids looking at screens and missing out on reading perhaps, and what's happening with parents being burnt out around the world.
It's the Happy Families Podcast.
For a happier family, try a Happy Families membership, because a happy family doesn't just happen. Details at happyfamilies.com.au.
It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. And today we are coming straight from the doctor's desk, and we have been talking about physical punishment and the negative impact that has on our children. And we're now going to jump right into screen use and the impact that it's having on our children's literacy skills, specifically reading.
Yeah, we'll just spend a minute or two on this one. It's pretty simple, really nice study. It's come out of Canada in the journal Pediatrics, very high-profile journal, I might just say, and it's looking at the longitudinal associations of screen use and reading in preschool-age kids. So basically, we've got nearly 2,500 Canadian families, and the kids are being looked at age 24 months, 36 months and 60 months. So at 2, 3 and 5, parents write down how much screen use they're getting and how much reading time they're getting. What do you reckon, Kylie? Do you think there's a relationship between the two? I mean, does this come from the University of Durr?
My suggestion is that it's pretty obvious that if our kids are watching a whole heap of screens and not being involved in the written word, that is going to impact their reading. But my question to you really is, at 2 years of age, do I need to be making sure my child is beginning reading?
Oh, a great question. So you've got an early childhood background. So let's talk about that in just a sec. But first off, we've got 2 years from the age of 2 to 3. What happened was that the more the kids were on screens, the less they read. And then from the age of 3 to 5, the less they read, the more they were on screens. So there's this reciprocal relationship going on. And like I said, University of Durr, of course that's going to happen. The question really is, do kids have to be in books at the age of 2? I mean, we've got really good evidence from around the world that kids can start reading as late as 6 and 7, like they do in the Scandinavian countries, and they still thrive. They, in fact, usually read better by the age of 11 than kids here in Australia or in the US who are learning to read from 4 and 5.
Well, I'd be really interested to know with that same study how much time parents spent reading with their children in relation to this. Because the reality is our children can watch screens, but reading at those ages, that comes down to me. Am I spending time reading with my child? Not so much have they spent 3 hours in front of the TV.
Yeah.
We know that excessive screen use has a huge impact on our children's development.
Especially when they're young.
But when I listen to a study like this, I kind of get a little bit frustrated because especially right now when we've got lockdowns all over the place and parents are stretched to the limits, the last thing we need them to do is feel like they're a bad parent because their kid's in front of a screen for more hours than they would like to even admit. The reality is if we want our children to have good literacy skills, then it's about spending that time together with them in books.
Yes. And
not about how much time they've watched the TV.
So this is where it gets really interesting, and I'm so glad you raised that, because ultimately we are the ones that decide whether the kids, to a very large extent, are going to love reading or not. And the younger we start them and the more involved they are with those books, the more likely it is that they'll love it, the more we're reading with them. And so what this is really kind of doing is it's looking at this displacement hypothesis. What do screens get in the way of? And it's clear that screens get in the way of reading. If we as parents can make sure that the kids are spending time in books, in reading with us and on their own, all of the evidence outside of that particular study is definitely going to support a much healthier approach to reading and much better outcomes there.
We're going to add that study to the show notes, but let's get into number 3,
Yep.
parental burnout. And I think this is actually probably the most interesting one for me anyway.
I'm fascinated by this study. This is a big study. I cannot count the number of researchers that are involved in this one. There are, actually I can, because I've got the number in front of me. There are 100 authors of this study.
Wow.
Because we're talking about a handful of people in each of the 42 countries that were studied here looking at parental burnout. This is parents who are just over it. They're wrecked. 71% of them were mothers. There were 17,500 parents. Average age of the parents, 39. Okay, so let me read through the list of those with the highest levels of parental burnout. Actually, do you reckon you can guess? Have a guess.
Oh, it's got to be the United States of America.
Yeah, it is. It is.
They're the biggest and the best, aren't they?
Who else would you say is right up there?
I reckon Australia is up there.
Unfortunately, you're right. We're in probably the top 5 for parental burnout. Now, by the way, they haven't listed it in order. I'm looking at a very complicated figure to get those details. But yeah, Australia is in the top 5. So the US is number 1. Who else?
Japan?
Japan was actually surprisingly low. They're in the bottom 30%.
Wow.
Yeah. We've got really big burnout for the USA, the UK, Australia, Canada, Belgium, France, Germany. They're the top countries in terms of who is the most stressed out.
Well, I want to know who's the least stressed out because I think we're moving.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you want to move to Pakistan
gosh.
or Colombia or Ecuador or Costa Rica or Peru or Vietnam or China or Thailand, but they were the bottom 10 in terms of parental burnout.
So that evokes 2 questions that I have. Number 1, how do we assess parental burnout?
So we measure burnout by something called the Parental Burnout Questionnaire. And basically it's a scale from
You're a scientist. You're so...
We want it to be easy to understand. This is why we do science, to help people learn stuff.
No creativity whatsoever.
It's called the PBA. So 0 on this means never. Okay. 1 means a few times a year. 2 means once a month or less. 3 is a few times a week. 4 is once a week. 5 is a few times a week. And 6 is every day. And there's 3 kind of scales in this questionnaire. The first one's all about emotional exhaustion. The second one's about how you are now compared with how you used to be as a parent. And the third one is about the loss of pleasure that you feel in your parental role. Oh, sorry, there is a 4th one as well, and that's having distance from your kids. So let me give you an example of these, and you give me a score from 0 to 6. And it's about how often you feel this. Okay? The first one, this is emotional exhaustion. I feel completely run down by my role as a parent.
That'd be maybe a 2.
Okay, so a few times a year.
Yeah.
Okay. Next one, we're talking about that contrast of who you used to be as a parent. We call it your previous parental self. I tell myself I'm no longer the parent I used to be. How often do you do that?
I think that's a 2-2.
2-2.
2-2.
1-1 was a racehorse. 2-2 was 1-2. 1-1 race 1 day. 2-2 1-1-2. Kids used to love it when I said that. The next one, loss of pleasure in one's parental role. I do not enjoy being with my children.
That would be a 1.
Yeah, okay. I'm really grateful that you've said that. Everyone's going, oh, you're so good now, Kylie. I am no longer able to show my children that I love them. There's that emotional distance.
Oh, that's a 0.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you said that. However, in the US, the UK, Canada and Australia, our top 5 countries for parental burnout, that's not what's coming through. Now, you said you had 2 questions. That's one of them. What was the other one?
Did the study give us any clues as to what we could do to navigate and minimise parental burnout?
No, it didn't. But I reckon if we look at what's really going on here, we can probably come up with some solutions ourselves because the researchers were just investigating it. They weren't coming up with solutions to solve it. Here's what they've really said here. They've said analyses of cultural values revealed that individualistic cultures in particular displayed a noticeably higher prevalence and average level of parental burnout. So it seems like individualism is playing a larger role in parental burnout than economic inequality or any other individual or family characteristic that they examined. And I haven't talked about all of the detail that went into this. Like, there's a whole lot of stats that we haven't talked about where they're trying to work out, is it this, is it that? They're basically saying, no, it seems like cultural values in Western countries are putting parents under excessive stress. So if we can move away from the rampant individualism that our society evokes and promotes, we're probably going to have healthier parents and therefore healthier kids. That's the real upshot of that entire study. So the long and the short of everything we've talked about today is, number one, there's no evidence for smacking kids being helpful at all. Please don't smack your kids. Number two, try to
read. Just read.
Read to them. Yeah, kids are going to watch screens. We get that, but read to them and get them to fall in love with reading. The younger, the better. And number three, let's all move to Peru. Live in a village. Raise the kids there. No more stress.
You know what? As much as that sounds really nice, I think just create the village here. Let's just take care of each other.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? Easier said than done, but definitely food for thought. Hey, we really hope that you've enjoyed the Happy Families podcast from the doctor's desk. We love sharing this podcast with you, and we love it even more when you jump onto Apple Podcasts and leave your ratings and reviews so that other people can find out about the podcast to make their families happier. To those of you who have done so, thank you. If you haven't yet, can you take 1 minute? It's literally that simple to leave a 5-star rating and review because it really helps other people to find the podcast. The Happy Families podcast is, as always, produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. And if you'd like more info about how you can make your family happier and reduce that burnout, stop smacking the kids and fall in love with reading to them, you can find it at happyfamilies.com.au.